Hello class, welcome to week 3 of React. This week we're going to talk about forms and we're going to talk about data fetching, APIs and fetch, and we're going to talk about prop types. So I just started up a normal Create React app. I created a new one. You don't have to create a new one if you don't want to, but you can. But you have seen this already, so I'm just going to remove this so we just have a blank slate. Move that. So we still have the app, we have our style sheet, and we have our logo. We don't need that. And we import React. So you've seen this a couple of times already, so I'm not going to go into that. So React forms. One thing to think about when using React forms inside React is something called controlled or uncontrolled input fields. So we're going to talk about what this means. So controlled input fields is something that we control. So when someone types something into the input field, we control the value, we save the value in state, and we put the value back into the input field. Let's try to see what this looks like. I'm just going to create a new file. I'm going to call it controlled input.js. I'm going to write the normal import React because we're building a React component. Going to make a arrow function. Controlled input equals to props, and then the arrow. And we're going to return some kind of input field. See here, we have an input field, type text. This is just a normal field. So let me just export default, controlled input, and then I'm just going to import that component inside my app file. Import controlled input from that file I just created. And we're just going to put that on the page. So now when it re-renders, we have an input field. So I can type whatever I want into this. This is called uncontrolled. So whatever I type, it doesn't control anything. I can just type in the keyboard and there's no code. We haven't built any code yet that controls what is typed into the field. So in React, uncontrolled input fields like this is not very useful to us because we have no way really of getting, well, we have some ways, but not any good ways of getting that data into the code if we want to do something with it inside the code. So let's try to make this, let's just first try to see what happens when I type value. An attribute of the input field is called value, and I can just type my name, and it will say mass in the field. So now this is a controlled field. You can see there's a warning down here. It said failed prop type, you provided a value prop to the field, but you didn't have an onChange handler. That's React saying you made a controlled field, but you have no way of changing it. So now I'm trying to type, you can't see that, but I'm typing on a keyboard, but it's going to be mass all the time. It's not going to be possible for me to change that because I hard coded the value in here to mass. So what we want to do is we want to have this as a controlled value. So when I change it, I add the onChange event handler. So every time I type something in the field, I can get that out that I type. I'm just going to make a function here. And we have the E. Remember that we covered that last time. So we're going to get the value with using value, E target value. I'm just going to log that out right now. Value, just going to put a string so we can see it. And I forgot to add the function in here. So now when I type something, you can see that the value here changes with the letter I type. It's still going to say mass and it's just going to say one letter. But every time I type, it's going to still have it hard coded to mass. So the value in the field is not going to change. But the onChange will detect that I typed one letter, but it will still just say mass. So next time I type a letter, it will just say mass in that letter. So we want to have the value that we type. We want to give that as a prop to the input field. So whatever I type is also what is visible in the field. So in order to do that, we need to use state. So I just import my useState hook so I can use state. Then I write the same. We've seen this a couple of times. I'm just going to call it value. I'm going to say set value. So we have the value first, then the setter. I'm going to say use state. And I'm going to give it an initial value. I'm just going to leave it empty. So I'm just going to give an empty string. So now I can use this value here. Instead of having a hard coded my name here, I can put the value. dot instead of a comma. There we go. So now when I type something, it's just going to be blank because it has the initial state is blank. So that's the initial value. And I put that in here. I still have a controlled value. I have my onChange, but the onChange doesn't do anything. So in order to get this to update, I need to use the setter from useState. So I'm going to say set value, value, because I saved that. I can also just set it directly like that. So now when I type something, it's going to look, see, it's going to look the same as when we had an uncontrolled value. But we see the way I actually do it is I have the prop or the attribute, since this is HTML, so it's not called props. It's the same concept. We have the attribute that I set to value. Every time I type something in, I call my function, which updates the state value to what's currently typed into the field. That's going to make it re-render with a new value, and then now value is going to be whatever I type in. So if I set initial state to mass, it's going to say mass when it initially renders, but now I can change it. And I have it saved inside my state variable. So this is called a controlled input field. And this is, I would say, probably most people would say, in React, you always use a controlled input field because it's not going to be possible, like I said earlier, to have, if you have an uncontrolled value, uncontrolled input field, you're not going to be able to get the value of that field into your code to use for something. And we probably, if we have an input field, we most likely want to use whatever the person types into it. So that is called a controlled input field. We already saw this a little bit. We had an exercise last week for this, and we saw it a little bit in class. So I expect that this would be understandable, at least. Okay, so we can make multiple. So how do we make multiple? Basically just copy. Let's just make another one. I'm just going to put a new div at the root, and then I can have two fields, right? Whoop, just did something crazy. There we go. So instead of having one onChange, I can have two onChange. I'm going to call this name. I'm going to call this, just going to put a break. I'm going to call this age. I'm going to have this second field here. So what's going to happen now? Right now I have two of these. I don't need that. So what's going to happen now is when I type something, both of them are going to be controlled using the same value field. So it's going to enter the same value for both. It's not ideal, but it works. But if you want to have separate ones, there are two ways to go about this. Either we can have, let's just rename this to name, so it'll be easier. So now I have onChange. I set the name. And in here, I'm going to make a separate one for the age. Age, and it's going to be just nothing. So I'm going to use age here. I'm going to have another onChange. OnChange age. I'm going to set age. And I'm going to just copy that in here. So now we have two separate ones. They have their own state, each of them. They have their own event handler, each of them. So now when I type it in, the first one is controlled by the name. The second one is controlled by the age. And it's going to give me a warning here. It says a component is changing from uncontrolled input of type text to be controlled. It's because I did some kind of mistake. So the reason it says this is uncontrolled is because I actually left this blank. So this is going to be undefined when it first loads, and then it's going to think it's uncontrolled. So let's just make it an empty string as well. And that's going to work now. So now we have two separate ones. Okay. Are we going to, yeah, we're just going to do a little trick. Okay, I'm just going to show you can imagine if you had 20 of these. Doing this 20 times gets a little repetitive. It's not really that much difference in this code. A couple of ways we can change that. We can, instead of having a separate function here, so we don't need to have 20 functions, I can just make the function directly here. And okay, I can just say set name, target value. It doesn't really help us very much because it's kind of the same code. I still need to do this every time. So a different way of doing that. No, let's just leave it at this actually. Let's not make it more complicated. This is and I could remove this onChange. It's going to do exactly the same thing. Now we just have an anonymous function here that takes the E and sets name, but at least we don't have to copy this 100 times. Concept is the same. Let's just leave it like this. This is easier to understand. Okay, so this is called a controlled variable. This is how we use input fields. It's how we use checkboxes or radio buttons or other types of fields that you typically see in a form. You would always use a controlled input. So you save whatever they type in state, you have your event handler, and then you put these two attributes into the input field so it has a value and an on change, and that makes it a controlled input field. Okay. So let's leave that as that. And then we're going to talk about data fetching. So I'm going to make a new component. I'm going to put this code up after this video. So let's make a new component called data fetching. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm just going to import React and just create the core component here. Data fetching. We're going to make our props here, and we're going to return something. Div, and I'm just going to say I want to fetch something. I'm going to export default, and then I'm going to go into my app, and I'm just going to import this. Data fetching. I didn't spell that right. Data fetching. There we go. So I'm just going to import that file I just created, and then we're going to put it here. We just put a header, data fetching. Let's put a header here, controlled input. Okay. So this is my first example. So data fetching. We're going to talk about using the fetch method and using APIs and how we do this. Okay, so we want to fetch some data here. We have an API called a random cat API. The URL is this, const API URL. I'm just going to put it outside my function because this is a constant. It's never going to change. So we have the API URL, and we can see if we call that, I'm just going to open it in browser. It will give us an image, which is a cat, random cat. Well, a few cats. And every time I refresh it, it's going to give me a different image. So it's just a random cat API someone built. Okay, so I want to fetch this. I want to fetch a cat as soon as the component mounts. We talked about this a little bit last time with data lifecycle methods. And in order to do this, I need to use effect. So use effect, I will put it here. Use effect, the first argument is a function that will be called every time this needs to run. And the second is an array of listeners, observers. It's going to observe different variables. I only want to run it when it first mounts, so I'm just not going to put anything here. Then it's going to run one time when it mounts. Let's just console log, I mounted. Let's see that work. So now we can see it says I mounted, and it says I assigned this variable that I didn't use, but that's fine for now because we're going to use it in a second. So now I need to fetch this data. If you remember from your JavaScript class, you just say fetch, you put the URL in, then you say then response JSON, convert it into JSON format, and then you get the result. And then I can console log out my result. Result. Let's just remove this one. So now when it first runs, it's gonna call, just make some lines so it's easy to see. It's gonna call fetch, and then it's going to convert it into JSON, and then we're gonna log out the result. And you can see it here. Result says file, and then it has this URL for an image. Okay, let's just get the file. I'm gonna use destructuring. So I can see this is an array. It has a key called file. So I can use destructuring using this syntax here. And I can just say equal result. So instead of having an object return, I just want the actual file. So it's here. This is the image. So let's make and then we want to save that. As we already learned, in order to get something out of this that we can use inside the React component, we need to store it in the state inside the component. Because otherwise we can't get from this callback in here, we can't get the variable out that we can use in the render. And I want to output it down here. I want to output this cat that I just fetched. So we're going to import use state. I'm just going to say cats. I'm going to make multiple. So I'm going to say cats. We're going to have an array. And then I'm going to say set cats. I'm going to use state. And as default value, because it has cats, plural, I need to use an array. I don't just want one cat. I want to be able to fetch multiple. We'll see why in a minute. So I'm going to use an empty array as the default value because it's at default there is nothing. And then when I get this file, I'm going to use set cats. Actually, let's just, I'm going to take the cats array and we're going to use, let's just call it next state, const next cats. I'm going to use cats. I'm going to use concat. I could have used push. Let's just do this first. Let's see what happens. Set cats, next cats. So now I update the state. I have my current cats, which is inside the use state. I use concat. Concat is the same as push. Push that you already know. Push mutates the array, so that's just going to push it directly into the same array as we use in the state. We typically don't want to do that because that can cause weird edge cases. So we typically always want to use the array method that returns a new array. So instead of using cats push, when I use cats concat, it's also going to add it to the array, but it's going to return a new array with the new items. And we can see that if we console log C state, I'm going to first output the cats array, and then I'm going to output the next cats array. I'm just going to see what that looks like. So you see here, when we use C state, the first array is empty. The second array has this item here. If I instead of this used push, let's just push it directly, cats push file, the first array is now also going to contain this. But that's not correct because the state cannot be modified directly. The state can only, these things here, be modified using the setter. So it's good practice not to use something like push because you modify the state directly. When you use concat, it will create a new array where it then adds that file. So you can see the difference between them. Now cats is still empty. The new array has this one file. And then I use set cats to update the state with the new array. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so now we have set cats. So we have some problem here. We can see one of them is that I use cats, which is a state variable. And every time I do this, it's even going to say this here as a warning. React hook use effect has a missing dependency, cats. Because when I use a variable here, I also need to listen to it because otherwise it will never update. So I could put it here, right? What happens now? It's just going to go into an infinite loop. You see? Let's just get rid of it before it crashes my browser. It called this like 100 times because every time I call it once, it's going to update the array. And when I listen to the array, it's going to call it again the second time. So how do we get rid of that? One way of getting rid of it is instead of having the fetcher in here that does all this stuff here, I'm going to make a separate function for this. I hope this makes sense. If I add the cats here and I also set cats here, every time it runs, it's going to set it and it's going to run it again. So it's going to keep calling this API indefinitely until your browser crash or the API crash. Probably your browser will crash first. And we don't want that. We only want to run it one time when it runs initially. So we're going to use a new function called addCat. So we're going to move our entire fetcher in here. and it's just going to call this. I'm just going to call this function here. Instead of listening to the cats array, I'm just going to call the function here. It's still going to give me an error, which we'll see in a second. So now I do exactly the same thing. I just move my fetcher out into a separate function. Try it. It calls it one time still, but now it says I have a missing dependency called addCat, because now I still use a method or variable that I created here, but I don't give it as a dependency. So if this ever changes, it's not going to know that it changed. So do we want to do this? We could. It's still going to run it indefinitely. And why does it do that? Do you see it runs it over and over again? Because every time I update the cats, the component is going to re-render all of it. It's going to create this function again. So when I listen to this add cats, I observe this function. It's going to change every time the component is re-rendered because it's created over and over again. This is a little bit of a weird, not a weird thing, but a thing you need to be aware of when using functional components. So every time it renders, every time cat updates, the whole component is going to re-render. It's then going to create this add cat function again. And even though we can see in the code that the function doesn't change, the React component will see that this one was recreated. It's not the same function as it was before, so it's going to run the use effect again. We don't want that. We only want to run it once. So we're going to introduce a new hook called use callback. Use callback is generally used, or it is used, to wrap around callback functions. It looks very similar to use effect. It actually looks exactly similar to use effect, where it has a function and it has an array of observers that it listens to. So when any of these observers change, let's just call it my function. When any of these observers change, it's going to recreate the function. But if none of them change, it's not going to recreate the function, so this function is going to look the same. So it's not going to re-render this every time because the function is not recreated. It's just going to render every time the function changes. Let's try to add it here. Use callback. So I use callback and I have my dependency array. Let's try that. So it's still gonna give us this. Use callback has a missing dependency cats because I used this cats array in here. So I could add it here, right? We're back to square one then. It's gonna keep re-rendering every time this cats is called.